Ethan Grayson sat in the plush leather seat of his black Rolls-Royce, the hum of the engine a faint whisper against the deafening silence inside him, his piercing ocean blue eyes fixed on the sprawling New York skyline that glittered like 1,000 promises he no longer believed in. At 31, he was the face of unimaginable wealth, an oil magnate whose name was carved into skyscrapers and whispered in boardrooms. Yet behind the immaculate suits and stone-carved jawline lay a man quietly suffocating beneath the weight of loneliness, haunted by his grandmother's voice that once told him, "Find a woman who loves Ethan the man, not Grayson the millionaire," a plea he had carried like scripture through the endless cycle of blind dates that left him emptier each time. 20 women in polished dresses and painted smiles who recoiled not from his soul, but from the simplicity he craved, their eyes lighting up only when they spoke of diamonds, yachts, and Parisian getaways, demanding the world yet offering no heart in return. The last rejection just hours earlier had felt like the final fracture in an already splintered heart, her laughter still echoing in his ears as she dismissed him for daring to speak of love without luxury, and the tabloids feasted on his misery, branding him the billionaire no one wants, with headlines splashed across glossy covers, reducing his quiet longing to a public spectacle. His assistants whispered about a curse, as if love itself had turned its back on him, and though his empire thrived, his nights were hollow, filled with whispered prayers to a god he wasn't sure was listening anymore. Rain streaked down the tinted windows as the city blurred into melancholy smears of light and shadow, and for the first time in years, Ethan wondered if happiness simply wasn't meant for him, if perhaps his wealth was a gilded cage rather than a blessing, trapping him in a life everyone envied but no one truly understood. Lost in thought, he barely noticed when his driver, distracted by construction detours, veered off the familiar highway and descended into the outskirts of Pennsylvania, the glittering skyline fading into a stark landscape of abandoned factories, rusting steel beams, and narrow roads lined with modest shacks where hope seemed rationed and every smile carried the weight of survival. It was here in this forgotten mining town scarred by decades of hardship that Ethan's restless gaze caught something unexpected, a flicker of life amid the ruin. Children chasing one another barefoot through dusty streets, their laughter raw and unpolished, yet more genuine than any laughter he'd heard in Manhattan's high society galas. The deeper they drove, the more his world of opulence felt like a distant planet, and something in his chest stirred, a pull he couldn't name but couldn't ignore, as if fate itself had taken the wheel. The car rolled past weather-worn houses patched with mismatched wood and tin, past tired faces that bore silent stories in the lines etched by struggle. And just as Ethan's mind lingered on turning back, they rounded a corner and he saw her, a young woman standing at the edge of the coal shaft, hair tied back with a faded ribbon, her hands blistered yet steady as she guided a younger boy away from danger, her presence so quietly commanding it arrested the very air in his lungs. She wasn't adorned in silk or jewels. No designer gown framed her figure, yet in her simplicity lay a kind of beauty Ethan had forgotten existed, beauty born not of wealth but of resilience, of soft strength weathered by storms. Something inside him shifted violently, a collision of recognition and yearning, as if all 20 rejections had led him here, to this single heartbeat suspended in time, to this stranger who hadn't yet looked up to see him, who didn't know his name, who didn't care about his billions, and for the first time in years, Ethan Grayson felt something foreign bloom in the hollow chambers of his chest. Hope, fragile and trembling, but alive. Clara Hensley balanced carefully on the uneven ledge of the coal shaft, her worn boots kicking up clouds of gray dust with every step, the cold wind tangling loose strands of chestnut hair that escaped her ragged ribbon. Yet somehow, even in that harsh landscape, she radiated a quiet strength, her presence like a single ray of sunlight forcing its way through a storm-heavy sky. Her hands, blistered and cracked from endless days of labor, held a rusted metal pail as if it were an extension of her very survival, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying exhaustion she'd long since learned to ignore, for there was no room for weakness in a life that demanded resilience just to make it to the next dawn. Her family's story was etched into every scar, generations bound to these mines, their lives traded for wages barely enough to buy bread. their dreams buried beneath layers of coal and unfulfilled promises. And when her father's accident had stolen his ability to work, Clara had quietly stepped into the role of provider, sacrificing youth and ease without complaint, carrying on her shoulders the weight of both duty and despair. From the back seat of the idle Rolls-Royce, Ethan Grayson watched her with a stillness he didn't recognize in himself, captivated not by beauty in the superficial sense, but by something rarer, something raw. She was unpolished, untouched by greed, her soft laughter drifting across the wind as she comforted a younger boy clinging to her side, her honey-brown eyes holding a warmth he hadn't seen in the cold glitter of Manhattan high-rises. For years, Ethan's life had been a revolving door of faces painted with expectation, women whose gazes measured him by the cut of his suit and the weight of his wallet. But this was different. This was real. And the realization struck him with such force that for a moment he forgot who he was, forgot the titles and the headlines, forgot the walls he'd built around his fractured heart. Just then, a sudden strike of machinery clanging shut forced the driver to brake abruptly, jolting Ethan out of his reverie and into action, compelling him to step out of the cocoon of leather and glass into the biting air, heavy with the scent of coal and sweat, his polished shoes instantly coated with grime, his tailored coat absurdly out of place among the rough-hewn men and weary women who turned briefly to glance at him before returning to their toil. Clara noticed him only when his shadow fell across her path, and when their eyes met for the first time, the world seemed to pause. The hum of machinery dulled, the shouts in the distance faded. Even the wind stilled, as if bearing witness to the collision of two worlds that never should have crossed, yet somehow did. She looked him over once, her gaze sweeping past the perfection of his suit and the gleam of his watch with neither awe nor envy, only quiet curiosity laced with caution. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, low but firm. "You look lost. Not your kind of place, is it?" A statement rather than a question, humble yet unafraid, cutting through the silence and straight into Ethan's guarded heart like a blade both gentle and sharp. No one had ever spoken to him like that, without pretense or performance, without the weight of knowing his name or fearing his power, and the simplicity of her words left him momentarily speechless, standing there among the dust and echoes of lives so different from his own, realizing for the first time that maybe what he'd been searching for all along was not found in penthouses or parties, but here, in the unlikeliest of places, in the steady gaze of a miner's daughter who didn't even know. She was holding the key to his fractured soul. Weeks slipped by like quiet whispers carried on the wind, each day pulling Ethan Grayson deeper into a world he had never known yet somehow always longed for, a world far removed from the glass towers and endless boardroom wars of Manhattan. He returned again and again to the mining town, always under the polished excuse of charitable outreach. His assistants parroted to the press, but in truth, the pull was singular. Clara Hensley. She had become gravity itself to him, drawing him back to the coal-stained streets and lantern-lit evenings with a force he could neither name nor resist, and every encounter with her unraveled another thread of the armor he'd worn for so long. He found himself seeking not the validation of wealth, but the quiet, unfiltered presence she offered, the way her honey-brown eyes listened when he spoke not of business but of the boy he once was, before the empire swallowed him whole. The boy who loved novels about lost adventurers and secretly feared growing old alone. In Clara's presence, Ethan rediscovered the forgotten pieces of himself. Memories of childhood summers on his grandmother's porch, the soft thrill of laughter that didn't feel forced, the strange comfort of silence shared without expectation. She never asked him about his fortune, never inquired about the sprawling penthouses or the private jets that defined his public life. And it unnerved him at first, this absence of ulterior motives, this rare sincerity. Instead, she asked about simple things, his favorite song, the moment he last cried, whether he ever missed the person he was before wealth claimed him, and each question cracked open a door he hadn't dared to touch in years, revealing vulnerabilities he didn't know he craved to share. Their conversations bloomed in stolen moments between her shifts at the mine and his manufactured site visits, moments by the rusted fence where C.T. Hildren played barefoot in the dust, moments under the flicker of kerosene lamps where the night hummed softly with the sound of crickets and distant machinery. And with each passing day, Ethan's resolve hardened, not to win her through grandeur, but to win her with truth, the very thing that had cost him 20 rejections before her. The night it happened was colder than usual, the air thick with the mingled scent of smoke and pine as the townspeople gathered for the annual bonfire, a rare celebration in a life otherwise defined by toil. Flames crackling high into the star-scattered sky, casting golden light on Clara's face as she stood laughing softly with a child perched on her hip, the glow turning her into something unearthly, something holy. Ethan watched her from across the fire for what felt like eternity, his chest tight with words he feared to speak, until the tension inside him broke like a dam and propelled him forward through the throng, heart pounding louder than the crackle of burning logs. When she saw him, her smile faltered. Not out of disdain, but out of that quiet curiosity she always wore when trying to decipher his intentions. And for a moment they stood suspended in the glow, two souls from worlds apart bound by a silence heavier than any spoken word. Ethan took her hand, not roughly, not with the entitlement she might have expected from men like him, but with trembling reverence, as though her calloused fingers were the most precious thing he'd ever touched. And in that hushed chaos, with laughter and music echoing faintly in the distance, he spoke, not of money, not of promises gilded in gold, but of honesty, raw and unadorned. "I've been searching for someone real," he confessed, voice low, yet unshakable, every syllable trembling with the weight of 20 past heartbreaks. "I've been rejected 20 times for being myself. Would you give me just honest and yes?" The words hung in the night air, fragile and electric, colliding with the unspoken truths between them. His longing for connection, her fear of being a charity case, the undeniable pull neither could deny. Clara froze, the firelight catching in her eyes as conflicting storms raged within her. She saw the divide between them clearer than anyone, the skyscrapers that loomed behind his name, the coal dust that clung stubbornly to hers, the gulf that seemed impossible to bridge. Yet in his gaze she found no judgment, only quiet desperation, a plea so pure it stripped away every pretense. Her heart thundered against her ribs, breath trembling in the cool night as memories of hunger, hardship, and endless responsibility flickered through her mind, reminding her of the dangers of trust, of love, of hope itself. But hope, stubborn and radiant, bloomed anyway. Against all logic, against the voice of reason screaming that this could only end in heartbreak, Clara stepped into the impossible, into the unknown, and whispered a single word that would alter both their lives forever. Yes. The moment Clara whispered yes by the bonfire, the air between them changed forever, and though her quiet consent lit a fragile flame in Ethan's chest, neither of them could predict the storm that awaited beyond the dusty roads of the mining town. Days later, when Ethan brought Clara into his world, a towering penthouse of glass and steel that kissed the clouds above Manhattan, the contrast was jarring, a collision of two universes that should never have met, yet now stood face to face. Clara's calloused hands trembled as she stepped into marble-floored halls adorned with priceless art and crystal chandeliers, the weight of unfamiliar luxury pressing against her chest as strangers' eyes followed her every movement. The board members, sleek in tailored suits, whispered behind manicured hands, their gazes sharp and appraising, seeing not Clara's courage but only her humble origins. And then came Veronica Grayson, Ethan's mother, Jeet, liding into the room like winter personified, her designer heels striking against the floor in measured rhythm, her presence commanding silence before she even spoke. Her eyes, icy blue and unyielding, raked over Clara from head to toe, lingering with disdain on her modest dress and work-worn fingers, and when her lips parted, venom dripped with each syllable. "A miner's daughter? You'll drag our name through the mud." The words cracked like a whip in the opulent room, drawing gasps from the onlookers and painting Clara's cheeks with silent humiliation. Yet she refused to bow, her spine straightening as she met Veronica's glare with quiet dignity, choosing silence over defense, strength over tears. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, jaw tightening as he stepped between them, his voice low but trembling with restrained fury. "Don't speak to her like that." But before the tension could break, another presence slipped into the chaos. Vanessa Monroe, Ethan's ex-fiancée, her beauty as immaculate as the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, her smile poised and poisonous. Vanessa's arrival was no accident, her timing deliberate, her intentions clear as she embraced Veronica with performative affection, whispering into her ear words sweetened with lies. "I warned you, didn't I? She's not here for love, she's here for what he can give her." Veronica's expression hardened further, and together they formed an unholy alliance, two women bound by a single purpose, to destroy Clara Hensley. Meanwhile, outside the polished walls of the Grayson empire, the media frenzy ignited like wildfire. Paparazzi swarmed Clara's every step, camera flashes blinding her as she shielded her face, headlines screaming across every glossy cover and news ticker. "Billionaire falls for minor girl, gold digger, or true love." Strangers dissected her life without knowing her name, speculating about her intentions, digging through her past for dirt that didn't exist, because truth mattered little in a world addicted to scandal. At night, Clara lay awake in Ethan's guest room, the silence deafening as she stared out at the glittering skyline, feeling smaller than she ever had in the coal shafts, wondering if love was enough to survive the storm brewing around them. Ethan, torn between protecting her and preserving the empire his family demanded of him, found himself fighting battles on every front, against the board who threatened to vote him out, against his mother whose approval he'd chased since childhood, and against Vanessa, who slithered into every vulnerable space with whispered threats and fabricated evidence of Clara's supposed deception. Yet through it all, Clara remained steadfast, refusing to abandon Ethan even as her heart cracked beneath the weight of cruelty she'd never invited. And in fleeting stolen moments when the noise of the world dulled and it was just the two of them, his hand covering hers beneath the dinner table, her head resting on his shoulder as city lights flickered below, they both clung to the fragile truth they'd found in each other. A love born not of riches or status, but of raw, undeniable connection, fragile, yet unbreakable, even as the storm threatened to tear them apart. The chaos of Manhattan still echoed in Clara's chest when Ethan led her away from it all, driving through winding roads until the noise of the city faded into the soft whisper of Vermont's pines. By the time they reached his secluded lake house, night had descended like a velvet curtain, the stars freckling the sky so vividly it felt as though heaven itself had bent low to watch them. The cabin stood modest for a billionaire, wooden beams, wide glass windows overlooking still water that mirrored the moonlight. But to Clara, it felt foreign and fragile, as though stepping inside might shatter a dream she wasn't sure she deserved. She wandered to the dock barefoot, the cool planks beneath her feet grounding her amid the storm raging in her heart, her simple white dress fluttering in the night breeze, its hem grazing the dark water below. Silent tears traced paths down her cheeks, glistening in the starlight, born not of weakness but of exhaustion. The exhaustion of fighting a world determined to remind her of what she wasn't. Ethan watched her from the doorway, hands buried in his pockets, his blue eyes softer than she'd ever seen them, no trace of the steel that guarded him in boardrooms or at high society galas, only a man stripped bare of pretense, terrified not of losing his fortune, but of losing her. When he stepped onto the dock, the wood creaked beneath his weight, and Clara turned slightly, wiping her face in a futile attempt to hide her tears, her voice trembling yet steady as she whispered, "I don't belong in your world, Ethan." A confession laid bare in the quiet night. He closed the distance between them slowly, as though approaching a frightened bird, each step deliberate, measured, reverent. When he finally stood before her, the scent of pine and lake water mingling in the cool air, his hands rose hesitantly before cupping her face, thumbs brushing away the remnants of her tears with a gentleness that startled her. "Then I'll leave it behind," he murmured, his voice raw with unguarded truth, "if it means I can belong in yours." And in that moment, the gulf between coal and gold, between skyscrapers and mine shafts, seemed to vanish, replaced by something purer, something unshakable. Their eyes locked, hers wide and uncertain, his searching and desperate, until silence gave way to inevitability, and he lowered his lips to hers. It was not a kiss born of hunger or conquest, but of solace, a meeting of wounds and promises, of two fractured, red souls daring to believe in healing. Her hands trembled as they rose to his chest, not to push him away, but to hold him closer. Fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as though anchoring herself to something real. He drew her in gently, their foreheads pressing together as the kiss broke. Both of them breathless, not from passion, but from the quiet enormity of the moment, because in that single touch, a vow had been made without words, that they would fight, that they would endure, that they would choose each other again and again, despite the storms awaiting them. The lake lapped softly at the wooden posts. Crickets hummed in distant harmony, and overhead the stars bore witness to a love so pure it silenced the chaos of the world beyond. They stood there for what felt like eternity, hands entwined, foreheads touching, hearts beating in fragile synchrony, as though afraid to speak lest the spell break. And when Clara finally exhaled a shaky breath against his cheek, Ethan smiled faintly, a smile not of triumph, but of relief, of gratitude, of quiet awe at having found, in the unlikeliest of places, the one thing his billions could never buy. That night, they did not speak of Veronica's disdain or Vanessa's schemes or the tabloids tearing them apart. They spoke instead in glances and quiet touches, in the language of two people who had found home not in a house or a fortune, but in each other. And as dawn threatened on the horizon, painting the water in shades of soft gold, Clara realized that for the first time in her life, love didn't feel like a burden to endure. It felt like belonging. The gentle peace of that Vermont night became nothing but a memory when they returned to Manhattan, where love had no sanctuary and happiness rarely survived the weight of wealth and expectation. Almost overnight, the tide shifted, whispers grew sharper, and Clara found herself standing on the front lines of a war she never chose, her every step stalked by flashing cameras and cruel headlines. The first strike C, aim like lightning. Vanessa Monroe's scheme, months in the making, unleashed at the perfect moment when Clara's guard was down and Ethan's trust seemed unshakable. The world awoke to photographs splashed across tabloids and social media feeds, grainy yet damning images of Clara in an embrace with a minor from her hometown, a childhood friend whose innocent presence was twisted into scandal. Captions screamed betrayal. Miner's daughter cheats on billionaire fiancé. And overnight, Clara went from Cinderella to pariah, her name dragged through mud thicker than any coal dust she'd ever known. Ethan stood frozen in his penthouse when the story broke, the weight of 20 past rejections and lifelong fears pressing down like iron chains, whispering the same poisoned refrain he'd fought to silence. "You'll never be loved for yourself." Clara stormed into his office, face pale, eyes red, clutching the tabloid in trembling hands, her voice cracking as she pleaded, "Do you think I'm like them? I loved you when you had nothing to offer but yourself." But her words collided with a wall of silence. His blue eyes clouded not with rage but with hurt so profound it bled into coldness. She tried again, voice breaking, "Ethan, look at me. You know me." But even as her tears fell, the weight of public scorn, Veronica's relentless disapproval, and Vanessa's whispered lies suffocated the fragile trust they'd built. Ethan turned away, jaw tight, his silence louder than any accusation, until finally, with a voice low and final, he cut the thread between them. "I can't do this, Clara." The room tilted, the ground vanished beneath her feet, yet she made no scene, no desperate plea, just quiet surrender. Because what good were words when love itself had been doubted? She walked away without looking back, her heart splintering with every step, returning to the coal town she'd once escaped, to the mines that demanded her body and numbed her soul. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, her life reduced again to blistered hands, soot-stained cheeks, and long nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how something so pure had turned to ash. Meanwhile, Ethan wore his heartbreak like armor, burying himself in business deals and board meetings, convincing the world he was unaffected while privately drowning in regret, haunted by flashes of her white dress fluttering by the lake, by the softness in her eyes when she whispered yes that night under the stars. He tried to hate her, tried to believe the lies splashed across headlines. But late at night, when silence pressed against the walls of his penthouse, doubts crept in. Small cracks appeared first, a report that didn't add up, An overheard comment about Vanessa's connections to the press, a photograph's timestamp that contradicted the scandal's timeline, and slowly, agonizingly, the truth began to emerge. One evening, he found himself standing in his mother's study, uninvited, as Veronica argued in hushed tones with Vanessa, the pieces falling into place with every venomous word. We had to do it. She'd ruin everything for him. Rage and realization collided in his chest, shame twisting like a blade as he understood the enormity of his mistake. Not only had he doubted Clara, he had destroyed her, cast her back into the very life she had trusted him to rescue her from. Memories assaulted him. Her trembling confession, her quiet strength, her refusal to defend herself even as the world crucified her. And suddenly the skyscrapers, the fortune, the family name he had spent his life protecting felt like a prison of his own making. For the first time, Ethan Grayson, billionaire oil magnate, felt powerless, not against markets or rivals, but against the loss of the only love that had ever been real. As winter blew into spring, the thought of her consumed him, her absence louder than any boardroom victory, and with every passing day, one truth crystallized in his soul. He had to find Clara, not to beg for forgiveness he didn't deserve, but to tell her the words he should have said the night he let her walk away, that she was his home, his heart, his everything, and he would burn the entire empire to the ground if it meant earning back even a single shred of her trust. Winter had sharpened its claws over the mining town, turning roads into rivers of ice and air into biting shards of frost. When Ethan Grayson finally returned, not as the billionaire heir whose name commanded headlines, but as a man stripped bare of pride and pretense, every step he took toward Clara heavy with regret and desperate hope. Gone were the tailored suits and polished shoes, replaced with scuffed boots, a wool coat dusted with snow, and hands reddened by the cold, trembling not from weather but from the storm raging inside him. For months he had lived with the ghost of her absence, every sleepless night haunted by her last words, every quiet moment poisoned by the memory of her tear-streaked face when he turned her away. And now, with the truth unraveled and Vanessa's lies laid bare, he knew there was only one thing left worth salvaging: her. The mine loomed ahead, its towering cranes and rusted beams silhouetted against a sky bruised with winter gray. Steam curled from vents, mingling with the rhythmic clang of pickaxes striking stone. And among the weary figures moving like shadows through coal-stained snow, Ethan searched for the only face that had ever made him feel human. He found her near the shaft, hair tied back with the same frayed ribbon, cheeks streaked with soot, her frame thinner, her posture heavier, yet her presence unchanged, still luminous, still utterly real. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps crunching against frost, surprise flashing in her honey-brown eyes before hardening into guarded caution. For an endless heartbeat, neither spoke, silence stretching between them like a chasm carved by months of hurt and misunderstanding. Then Ethan dropped to his knees in the snow, heedless of the cold seeping through denim, heedless of the onlookers whose whispers turned to stunned gasps. He bowed his head, voice breaking as the words poured out, not rehearsed, not polished, but raw and bleeding with truth. 20 women said no because they loved my money, he began, each syllable trembling. But you said yes when I had nothing. I doubted you, Clara. I failed you. Please, I'm begging you. Say yes again. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled, carrying only the soft hiss of steam and the distant groan of machinery as Clara stood frozen, heart pounding in her chest. Memories surged unbidden, his hand in hers by the lake, the softness in his eyes when he whispered he'd leave it all behind, the cold finality of his rejection, the nights she wept alone in the darkness of this very mine. Her lips parted, but no words came, only tears, silent, unbidden, not from fresh pain but from the release of carrying so much alone. Slowly, trembling, she knelt before him, her fingers, rough from labor yet gentle as prayer, lifting his face from the snow. I never stopped loving you, she whispered, voice cracking like fragile glass. I just didn't know if you'd ever come back. Ethan's breath shuddered, blue eyes glistening as her words carved into him deeper than any wound. He rose slowly, guided by her hands, until they stood face to face, foreheads pressed together, the rest of the world blurring into nothingness. In that quiet, forgiveness bloomed, not in grand declarations, but in the steady beat of two hearts daring to sink again. He kissed her then, not with hunger, but with reverence, a promise sealed in the silence of falling snow, and for the first time in months, warmth returned to the winter air. Months later, spring crept cautiously into the mining town, thawing ice into rivulets and coaxing wildflowers through cracks in stone. Where once there had been only toil and hardship, there was now celebration, laughter echoing through streets strung with lanterns and wild ribbons. Ethan and Clara wed not in a cathedral or penthouse, but in the heart of the place that had shaped them both, beneath open skies, surrounded by miners and children whose hands bore witness to the same hardships Clara once carried alone. She wore a simple white dress, hem brushing dusty ground, hair loose and kissed by the breeze. He wore rolled sleeves and no tie, the proud billionaire unrecognizable save for the love blazing in his blue eyes. There were no diamonds, no flashing cameras, only quiet vows exchanged under starlight, lanterns swaying like constellations brought to earth. "Rich or poor, dust or gold," Clara whispered, voice steady though tears glistened on her lashes. "I choose you, Ethan." His reply trembled with quiet awe. "In every life, in every world, I will always find my way back to you." Cheers erupted, unpolished and pure, as neighbors clapped calloused hands and children danced barefoot on worn wooden planks, their joy untainted by wealth or pretense. Music swelled, not an orchestra, but fiddles and harmonicas played by friends, melodies rising into the night like prayers of gratitude. In that moment, as Ethan spun Clara beneath strings of lantern light, the weight of legacy and fortune melted away, leaving only this: a man who had been lost, and the woman who had saved him without ever trying. For the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson felt truly wealthy, not for the empire he'd inherited, but for the love he'd nearly lost and finally learned to deserve.